It all started as an ordinary family photo shoot. A young couple with triplets posed for pictures, not realizing that the photographer would notice something that would turn their lives upside down. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching us from. The late afternoon sun spilled lazily through the slats of the blinds, casting golden stripes across the small living room where the soft hum of life filled every corner. It was not a grand house, not the kind you'd find in glossy magazines or on polished postcards, but it was home. A modest, two-bedroom space nestled in a quiet neighborhood where children's laughter echoed down the streets and neighbors greeted one another like family. The walls were adorned with photographs, snapshots of simple yet priceless moments, smiles framed by birthday balloons, tiny hands grasping at cake, and eyes wide with wonder at the world. Among those images, the most recent ones captured the heart of the house, the three small boys whose presence had transformed everything. Mornings in this home began not with silence, but with the rustling of tiny limbs and soft giggles leaking from the nursery. The boys were not yet 2, but already they filled every room with their boundless energy. Each morning, Monica would wake to the rhythmic patter of little hands slapping against the crib rails, followed by muffled babble and the occasional shriek of excitement. Drowsy but smiling, she would slide out of bed, smoothing her hand over the empty side where her husband had already risen for the early shift, and pad barefoot across the hall to greet her 3 little whirlwinds. Monica and Derek Brooks had built this life together, piece by piece, starting from very little. They were both children of the same neighborhood, having grown up a few streets apart without knowing that the world would one day weave their paths together. It wasn't a love story born of drama or chance meetings at grand events. It was one of familiarity, of small conversations that grew into deeper ones, of understanding and partnership. When they married, they didn't have much, but they had each other and the kind of love that burns slow and steady, not wild, but strong enough to weather storms. Their biggest dream, the one they had whispered about in the quiet darkness of their shared bed, had always been to have a family. It had been a dream touched by struggle, though. Monica's road to motherhood had not been smooth. She had spent years believing that maybe this dream would never come true for her. They had weathered the heartbreak of false hopes, of doctors' hesitant words, and of nights spent holding each other in silence when there were no words left to soothe. So when, after years of waiting, she learned she was pregnant, it felt less like a surprise and more like a miracle. That miracle came with 3 heartbeats. The memory of the ultrasound remained vivid in her mind, even now. The way the technician's face had shifted from casual professionalism to stunned disbelief. How she had glanced at Monica, then at the screen, and back again, before softly saying, "There are 3 triplets." The pregnancy had not been easy. There were days when she could barely move without wincing, nights when sleep eluded her completely. The doctors warned her about the risks, about premature birth, low birth weights, and the delicate line she would have to walk to bring her baby safely into the world. But she had never once wavered. Derek stood beside her through every appointment, every late-night craving, every tear of fear, and every smile of anticipation. They had walked that fragile road together. When the boys arrived, it was weeks earlier than expected, in a flurry of bright lights and hushed urgency. The sterile chill of the hospital corridors had clung to them, but none of it mattered when she heard those cries for the first time. Each of her sons had been so small then, their tiny bodies dwarfed by tubes and machines designed to keep them alive. It had been a terrifying, fragile beginning, But they had fought, each of them, and now they were home. Jaden, Malik, and Corey, her heart divided neatly into 3 pieces. Each boy was unique in his own way. Jaden was the quietest, the one who observed the world with wide, serious eyes before reacting. Malik had energy spilling out of every inch of his tiny frame, always the first to crawl toward mischief, to climb where he shouldn't, to laugh the loudest. Corey was somewhere in between, a little clingy, a little shy, but endlessly sweet. Monica moved through her day like a dancer, weaving around toys and blocks, balancing bottles and diapers, chasing after crawling bodies that seemed to multiply by 3. Her exhaustion was bone deep, but it was wrapped in the soft warmth of joy. Every touch, every giggle, every sticky kiss on her cheek was a reminder of what they had nearly lost, and what they now had in abundance. Derek, for his part, was the kind of father who wore his heart openly. He worked long hours, often sacrificing sleep and rest to provide for his family, but he came home every evening with a smile ready and arms open. The sight of his sons racing, crawling, as fast as they could to greet him at the door, was enough to melt away the weight of the day. Their home was a symphony of small sounds. The shuffle of soft feet across carpet, the squeak of rubber toys, the soft rustle of picture books being turned by clumsy hands. Even the cries and tantrums, the occasional crash of something falling from an unstable surface, belonged to the fabric of their happiness. It was during the quiet moments, when the boys were napping and the house settled into an unfamiliar hush, that Monica found herself watching them with a kind of aching tenderness. Time felt like sand slipping through her fingers. The days were long and exhausting, but the months were flying by. Already, they were growing faster than she could keep up with, each day bringing new words, new abilities, new independence. One evening, as she folded freshly laundered baby clothes and Derek leaned against the door frame, she said aloud what had been pressing against her heart. "They're changing so fast." He looked over at her, brow furrowed slightly in question. "The boys," she clarified. "It's like every day they're a little taller, a little stronger. I don't want to forget this." Derek crossed the room and sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. He didn't need to say anything. She could feel the same wistfulness in his silence. That night, after the boys had been bathed and tucked into their cribs, after lullabies had faded into soft breathing, Monica opened her laptop and began searching for photographers. She wanted something more than just casual phone snapshots. She wanted someone who could capture the essence of these days, the chaos, the joy, the tiny hands and sleepy smiles. That's how she came across Amara's website. It wasn't flashy, but the photos told stories. Real families, imperfect and beautiful, children with food on their faces, parents with tired eyes but glowing smiles. Monica scrolled for a long time, heart tightening at the warmth in each frame, until she finally reached for her phone. The decision felt like a small but important step, an effort to hold on to something precious before it slipped away. The days leading up to the photo shoot were a whirlwind. Life with 3 toddlers left little room for anything beyond the essentials, but Monica took extra care that week. She picked out outfits, cleaned the living room twice as much as usual, and tried to keep the boys from hurting themselves too badly in their usual antics. Derek teased her gently about it, but she could tell he understood. On the morning of the shoot, the house was alive with movement. The boys sensed something unusual in the air and responded in kind, refusing breakfast, wrestling each other over toys, crying without cause. Monica tried to keep calm, smoothing their curls and dressing them in matching suspenders and tiny button-down shirts, though she knew by now that keeping 3 toddlers clean for more than 5 minutes was a lost cause. By the time Derek arrived home early from work to help, the house was a mess again, and Monica was laughing at the absurdity of trying to create order in the middle of chaos. Still, when the doorbell rang and Amara stood there, camera slung over her shoulder and a warm, knowing smile on her face, Monica felt something shift. Maybe, she thought, this was exactly the kind of moment worth remembering. The imperfection, the noise, the love stitched into every second. She didn't know yet how much that day would change everything. The morning of the photo shoot arrived beneath a sky veiled in soft gray clouds, casting a muted glow over the quiet neighborhood. It wasn't a gloomy day, just subdued, as though the world itself had decided to pause and hold its breath for a while. Inside the Brooks home, however, there was no such calm. The house pulsed with the restless energy of 3 small boys who had no understanding of what the day had in store. Monica was already up before the first sounds of stirring came from the nursery. She stood at the kitchen counter, sipping coffee that had long since gone cold, her eyes flickering over the outfits she had laid out the night before. 3 small button-down shirts, ironed meticulously after the boys had finally fallen asleep. 3 pairs of tiny suspenders, matching socks, and polished baby shoes that she knew wouldn't stay on for longer than a minute. It seemed silly, she thought, as she stared at the carefully arranged clothes. They were only babies after all, but this meant something to her, capturing a moment before it slipped away. The boys woke almost in unison, as they often did, their voices rising like a choir of chaos. Monica moved quickly, already knowing how the day would unfold if she didn't stay ahead of it. She scooped Jaden into her arms first, his little body still warm and heavy with sleep, his head resting against her shoulder. He smelled faintly of baby shampoo and the lavender lotion she massaged into their skin each night. Malik and Corey soon followed, each clamoring for her attention, their small fingers reaching out, their legs kicking restlessly. Breakfast was an event in itself. Derek had come home early from his shift, and together they attempted to coax the boys into eating something other than the pieces they could fling across the table. Malik smeared banana across his cheeks. Corey managed to overturn his cereal bowl twice, and Jaden picked at his food with an absent-minded air, as though already distracted by something no one else could see. Monica tried not to let her nerves show as she wiped sticky fingers and cleaned spilled milk from the floor. When the knock finally came at the door, it felt like a relief, a sign that, at least for the next hour, someone else would take the lead. She opened it to find Amara standing there, camera bag slung across her shoulder, her smile warm and disarming. Amara was a woman who exuded calm. She stood tall, dressed simply in jeans and a loose sweater, her dark curls pulled back into a ponytail, her expression open and kind. Monica had spoken to her only briefly during their phone call, but in person, she radiated a quiet confidence that made Monica's shoulders ease a little. They exchanged the usual pleasantries, and then Amara stepped inside, her eyes immediately drawn to the whirlwind of movement in the living room. Malik was crawling at full speed toward the toy box. Corey had found one of Derek's shoes and was attempting to chew on it, and Jaden sat quietly by the window, watching the dust particles dance in the soft light. Monica apologized for the mess, but Amara waved it off with a knowing smile. "This is what I'm here for," she said simply. The next hour unfolded in a blur of movement and laughter and the occasional shriek of frustration. Amara worked like a magician, her camera clicking rhythmically as she crouched, knelt, and moved seamlessly around the boys. She didn't ask them to pose. She didn't try to orchestrate perfection. Instead, she followed them, capturing Malik's triumphant grin when he stacked 2 blocks together, Corey's delighted giggle when he tumbled into a pile of pillows, and the way Jaden's eyes seemed to linger on everything, absorbing the world with a quiet intensity. Monica and Derek tried their best to stay out of the way, though they were often pulled into the frame by tiny, outstretched hands. Amara encouraged it, telling them to laugh, to play, to forget she was even there. And slowly, that's exactly what happened. The house filled with the sound of their joy, the kind of sound that wrapped around the walls and made a home feel alive. It wasn't until the session was nearly over that something shifted. Amara had been reviewing a few shots on her camera, a small smile playing on her lips, when she glanced up and caught sight of Jaden near the edge of the room. The other 2 boys were engaged in their usual antics, crawling over each other, pulling toys from the bin. But Jaden sat apart, his small body slumped slightly forward, his head drooping. Monica noticed the shift in Amara's expression, a subtle crease in her brow, a flicker of something like concern. She followed the photographer's gaze and frowned. "Jaden?" she called gently. The boy lifted his head at the sound of her voice, his eyes brightening momentarily, but there was something in the way he moved that tugged at her. His small arms wobbled slightly as he tried to push himself up. He made it halfway before settling back onto the floor with a soft huff. Amara didn't say anything right away. She simply watched, her camera forgotten in her hands, her gaze following the boys' every movement. They wrapped up the session soon after, the boys growing tired and cranky, rubbing their eyes and tugging at their clothes. Derek gathered Corey and Malik, herding them toward the nursery for their nap, while Monica lingered by the door with Amara. "Thank you so much," she said, reaching for her phone to arrange payment. "I know it must have been chaos." Amara shook her head, her smile returning, though there was something softer about it now. "It wasn't chaos," she said. "It was beautiful." There was a pause, a hesitation in the air, and then Amara added, her voice gentle, "I hope you don't mind me saying, but have you noticed that your little one, Jaden, seems a bit slower than his brothers?" Monica blinked, caught off guard. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her mind scrambling to process the comment. "He's quieter," Amara continued quickly, sensing her discomfort. "It's not necessarily anything. Every child is different. I noticed he seems to tire easily." Monica forced a smile, brushing off the knot that had begun to form in her stomach. "He's always been the calm one," she said. "Not as wild as the other 2. Amara nodded, accepting the answer, but there was a look in her eyes that lingered long after she had left. The house felt quieter in the aftermath of her departure, the only sounds the soft breathing of the boys asleep in their cribs and the distant hum of traffic outside. Monica stood in the living room, her arms folded over her chest, staring at the spot where Jaden had been sitting. She shook her head, willing the uneasy feeling away. Children were different. She knew that. Jaden had always been the quiet one, the thoughtful one. Not every child needed to be loud and rambunctious to be healthy. She told herself that again and again as she tidied up the scattered toys and folded the tiny shirts they had worn for the photos. But when Derek came back into the room and saw the expression on her face, he knew something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Monica hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing," she lied. "Just tired." Later that night, after the boys had been bathed and tucked back into their cribs, after the house had finally settled into the rare stillness of sleep, Monica sat alone at the kitchen table, her phone in her hand. She opened the photo gallery, scrolling through the images Amara had already sent over. The photos were beautiful, more beautiful than she had hoped. They captured everything: the mess, the chaos, the love that lived in every corner of their home. But in each frame, her eyes kept drifting to Jaden. The way he leaned a little too heavily against the wall, the slight pallor in his cheeks, the subtle droop of his shoulders when he thought no one was looking. A seed of unease had been planted that day, small but persistent, and no matter how many times she told herself not to worry, it refused to stop growing. The next morning unfolded like any other in the Brooks household, beginning with the familiar shuffle of small feet against the crib rails and the soft, rising chorus of babbling voices. The sunlight had barely begun to filter through the blinds when Monica felt a tug on her consciousness, the fragile line between sleep and wakefulness breaking as Corey's muffled whimper echoed down the hall. She opened her eyes, expecting the usual wave of exhaustion, but it wasn't the fatigue that weighed heavy on her chest. It was something else entirely, something planted deep the day before, something she hadn't been able to shake. The photo shoot should have been nothing more than a beautiful memory, a small, joyful moment frozen in time. But now the images lingered in her mind like a shadow she couldn't outrun. It wasn't the chaos of the day that unsettled her, nor the whirlwind of trying to corral 3 toddlers into smiling for the camera. It was Amara's words, soft and careful, but sharp enough to leave an imprint. "Have you noticed that your little one seems a bit slower than his brothers?" The question had clung to her like a thread she couldn't stop pulling. She had spent hours the night before replaying the photographer's expression, the subtle crease in her brow, the way her eyes had lingered on Jaden. She had scrolled through the photos again and again, looking for something, anything, that would make her doubt her own instincts. Each image only seemed to feed the gnawing worry at the back of her mind. She moved on autopilot that morning, going through the motions of dressing the boys, preparing breakfast, cleaning up spilled milk and scattered cereal, all while her eyes flickered constantly to Jaden. He sat quietly in his high chair, poking absent-mindedly at a piece of toast, his eyes distant, as though watching something beyond the walls of the kitchen. Malik was already attempting to climb out of his chair, and Corey had smeared banana across his forehead like war paint. But Jaden remained still. Derek noticed too. He leaned against the kitchen counter, sipping his coffee, his gaze following Monica's every movement. "You've been quiet," he said finally, his voice low so as not to startle the boys. Monica shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Just tired." But Derek knew her too well to believe it. He waited, giving her space, letting the silence stretch until she finally sighed and set down the spoon in her hand. "Yesterday," she began, her voice hesitant, "Amara said something about Jaden." Derek's brow furrowed immediately. "What about him?" "She said he seemed slower, tired, like he was having a hard time keeping up." Derek's first instinct was to brush it off, to reassure her. "You know how Jaden is. He's always been the quiet one." Monica shook her head, the words catching in her throat. "That's what I told her. That's what I've been telling myself. But then I started thinking, maybe it's not just who he is." Derek set his cup down carefully, his expression softening. He crossed the room and touched her arm gently. "You've been worrying about this all night, haven't you?" She nodded, swallowing the lump that had formed in her throat. He didn't try to dismiss her fears. Instead, he looked over at Jaden, who was now resting his head against the back of his chair, eyes half-lidded despite the noise his brothers were making. "Let's keep an eye on him," Derek said quietly. "If something's wrong, we'll catch it." But keeping an eye wasn't enough for Monica. As the day unfolded, her unease grew, the seed of doubt taking root in every glance she cast toward her son. She noticed things she hadn't before, or perhaps she had noticed them, but had brushed them aside, chalking them up to personality, to harmless differences. In the afternoon, while the boys played in the living room, she watched Malik and Corey scramble over each other to reach the pile of blocks scattered on the rug. Jaden sat nearby, legs splayed out, fingers resting limply in his lap. He smiled faintly when Corey handed him a block, but made no move to join their game. When Monica called for snack time, Malik and Corey came racing, small feet pattering across the hardwood floors. Jaden tried to follow, but stopped halfway, sitting back down heavily, as though the effort had drained him. That evening, after the boys were tucked into bed and the house had settled into its usual nighttime hush, Monica found herself scrolling through articles on her phone, reading about childhood development, milestones, things that could explain Jaden's behavior. Each headline felt like a slap, words like delays, fatigue, underlying conditions flashing before her eyes. She closed her phone abruptly, heart pounding. The following morning, she made a decision. After breakfast, while Derek was at work, she called their pediatrician's office and made an appointment. The receptionist's voice was calm, professional, unbothered by Monica's fumbling explanation about why she wanted to bring Jaden in. When she hung up, the knot in her stomach remained, but it was tempered by a sense of relief. Action, finally, instead of silence. She didn't tell Derek right away. She wanted to wait, to see if she was overreacting, if the doctor would pat her on the shoulder and tell her everything was fine. The day of the appointment arrived quickly. Monica bundled Jaden into his jacket, leaving Malik and Corey with Derek's mother for the afternoon. Jaden clung to her quietly during the car ride, his small fingers curling around the fabric of her sleeve. The waiting room was filled with the soft chatter of other parents, the occasional cry of a baby, the rustling of magazines. Monica sat stiffly, her knee bouncing nervously, her hand resting protectively on Jaden's back. The examination itself was routine, clinical. The doctor, a woman Monica had seen since the boys were born, greeted them warmly, asked questions, measured Jaden's weight and height, checked his reflexes. Monica answered mechanically, watching every movement, every glance. It wasn't until the doctor placed her stethoscope against Jaden's chest that Monica saw the subtle shift in her expression. A crease formed between her brows, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a jolt of fear down Monica's spine. The doctor asked her to wait while she checked something. When she returned, her smile was careful, practiced. "I'd like to run a few more tests," she said gently, "just to be sure." Monica nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. The next hour passed in a blur. Blood tests and EKG, quiet conversations in the hallway that Monica strained to overhear. By the time they left the clinic, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the pavement. That evening, when Derek came home, she told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable until she finished and let the silence hang between them. "You did the right thing," he said finally, pulling her into a tight embrace. But Monica didn't feel reassured. Not yet. The following day, the phone call came. The doctor's voice was calm but serious, her words measured. They had found something that needed further investigation. Monica felt the world tilt beneath her as she scribbled down the details, her hands shaking. When she hung up, Derek was already standing in the doorway, reading her face. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. Monica swallowed hard, the words catching in her throat. "They want us to take him to the hospital," she whispered, "for more tests." Derek didn't say anything right away. He crossed the room, wrapped his arms around her, and held her tightly. The seed of doubt had grown into something real now, something they could no longer ignore. The hospital was colder than Monica had imagined, even though the spring air outside had already begun to warm, softening the edges of the season. Inside, everything felt sterile and controlled, the kind of place where emotions had no room to breathe, no place to settle. The hallways stretched endlessly in either direction, the floors scrubbed to a shine, the hum of machines faint behind closed doors. She held Jaden close against her chest, his head resting on her shoulder, his small fingers tangled in the fabric of her sweater. He had fallen asleep on the drive over, lulled by the soft hum of the car and the gentle sway of her arms, and had stayed asleep as they carried him inside, past nurses and reception desks and quiet, waiting faces. Derek walked beside her, his steps measured and tense. He hadn't said much since the phone call from the pediatrician, but his silence wasn't indifference. It was a quiet bracing against the unknown, against the heavy weight of what might come next. They were led to a private room at the end of a quiet corridor, away from the usual din of emergency cases and visiting families. The nurse who greeted them was soft-spoken, her smile kind but tinged with something that made Monica's stomach twist. A look she recognized now, the one people gave when they were trying to cushion bad news before it arrived. The next hours passed in fragments. There were forms to fill out, signatures to provide, questions asked and answered. Jaden woke briefly as they took his vitals, blinking sleepily at the unfamiliar ceiling before curling back against Monica's chest. The doctors came in and out, explaining the need for tests, reassuring them in the gentle, professional way that doctors do, enough to calm, but never enough to erase the weight in the room. The tests began almost immediately. Blood work first, followed by an echocardiogram, the rhythmic pulse of the machine filling the small space as a technician moved a probe across Jaden's chest. Monica watched every movement, every shadow on the screen, though she didn't understand what she was seeing. The technician said nothing, her expression neutral, her focus trained on the flickering images. Derek sat silently in the corner, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes never leaving their son. By the time the last test was complete, the sky outside had shifted to the deep, dusky blue of evening. The nurse who returned to the room brought them water and offered to bring something for Jaden to eat, but Monica declined. Her stomach was a knot of nerves, and Jaden, worn out from the poking and prodding, had drifted back to sleep. They waited. The waiting was the worst part, an endless stretch of minutes and hours that felt heavier with every tick of the clock. Derek sat beside her, his knee bouncing anxiously, his gaze flickering to the door every time footsteps passed in the hallway. Monica ran her fingers gently over Jaden's curls, her heart pounding louder than the faint beeping of the monitors around them. When the door finally opened and the doctor stepped inside, Monica knew before a single word was spoken. The woman who entered was the same who had overseen Jaden's tests, a cardiologist whose name Monica had barely registered when she introduced herself earlier. Now her face was carefully composed, her hands folded gently in front of her. "Mr. and Mrs. Brooks," she began, her voice soft, practiced. thank you for your patience." Monica's breath caught in her throat. She tightened her hold on Jaden, feeling the weight of his small body like an anchor. The doctor continued, her words deliberate, each one landing like a stone. "We've reviewed Jaden's tests, and we've identified a congenital heart defect. Specifically, he has a condition called tetralogy of Fallot." The words meant nothing at first, a jumble of syllables that felt foreign and sharp. Monica glanced at Derek, who looked as stunned as she felt. The doctor kept speaking, explaining the condition in careful, measured detail. 4 defects in the structure of the heart, restricted blood flow to the lungs, lower oxygen levels in the blood, symptoms of fatigue, difficulty breathing, developmental delays. Monica heard the words, but they felt distant, as though she were underwater, her ears filled with the rush of her own pulse. She felt Derek's hand slide over hers, gripping tightly. "What does this mean?" he asked quietly. The doctor's gaze softened. "It means that Jaden's heart isn't functioning the way it should. It's working harder than it needs to, and it's why you've noticed him tiring more quickly than his brothers." Monica swallowed hard, her throat burning. "Can it be fixed?" she asked, her voice shaking. The doctor nodded. "There are treatments. Surgery is typically required to repair the defects. It's not uncommon, and outcomes are very good when the condition is treated early. But it is serious. Left untreated, it can lead to complications." The conversation continued. Questions, answers, information about next steps. The doctor spoke of pediatric cardiothoracic surgeons, of scheduling further evaluations, of preparing for a procedure that would require general anesthesia and weeks of recovery. She talked about risks and success rates and the importance of timing. Monica nodded when she was supposed to. She asked the right questions, or at least tried to, but all she could hear, over and over, was the word surgery. When the doctor finally left, promising to return with the next steps, Monica sat in silence, her hand still curled protectively over Jaden's back. Derek exhaled shakily beside her. "We'll get through this," he said, more to himself than to her. Monica nodded, but the knot in her chest didn't ease. The ride home that night was quiet. Jaden slept in his car seat, his soft breathing the only sound in the car. Monica stared out the window, her reflection fractured by passing streetlights. Derek's hand rested on her thigh, a silent gesture of reassurance, but neither of them spoke. When they pulled into the driveway, the house loomed in the dark, the porch light casting long shadows across the steps. Derek's mother greeted them at the door, her expression etched with concern, but Monica couldn't bring herself to say the words out loud. She simply hugged her tightly, holding on longer than necessary before gathering Malik and Corey into her arms. That night, after the boys were asleep and the house had settled into stillness, Monica sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the folded hospital papers in her lap. The diagnosis felt unreal, like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating and inescapable. Derek sat beside her, his arm sliding around her shoulders. "We're going to do whatever it takes," he said quietly. "We'll get him through this." Monica nodded, but her throat tightened painfully. She wanted to believe him, to draw strength from his certainty, but all she could see was her baby boy's face. His soft, sleepy smile, the way he had curled into her arms without knowing that his heart was a fragile thing. The next days were filled with phone calls and appointments, consultations with specialists who spoke in careful, clinical tones. The surgery was scheduled for 6 weeks later, time enough to prepare, to plan, to hope. But those weeks felt like a lifetime. Monica and Derek moved through them in a daze, balancing the demands of daily life with a constant, gnawing anxiety that lingered in the back of their minds. They still had to care for Malik and Corey, still had to manage meals, baths, bedtime routines. The boys were too young to understand what was happening, oblivious to the tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. Monica tried to keep their days as normal as possible. She took the boys to the park, read them stories at night, sang lullabies until their eyes fluttered shut. But when she looked at Jaden, she couldn't stop seeing the thin line of blue around his lips when he tired, the way his breathing grew shallow after too much excitement. She became hyper-aware of every movement, every stumble, every moment when he seemed to struggle more than his brothers. It consumed her, this constant vigilance, until it felt like she was holding her breath every second of the day. Derek remained her anchor. He stayed strong when she felt herself unraveling, shouldering the weight of the practicalities, the insurance paperwork, the scheduling, the endless logistics of preparing for what lay ahead. But she could see it in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. The fear, the helplessness, the quiet desperation of a father who couldn't fix what was broken. The night before the surgery, Monica stood in the nursery doorway, watching the three boys asleep in their cribs. The soft glow of the nightlight bathed the room in a gentle warmth, the steady rise and fall of their chests the only sound in the quiet. She felt Derek's presence behind her, his hand resting lightly on her back. "He's going to be okay," he whispered. Monica nodded, her eyes never leaving Jaden's face. But deep down, she knew that no amount of reassurance could quiet the storm raging inside her. Tomorrow, everything would change. The morning of Jaden's surgery arrived cloaked in a fragile quiet that felt unnatural in the Brooks household. Normally, the house stirred before dawn with the sound of small voices, the rustling of blankets, and the rhythmic thump of tiny feet against crib rails. But that morning, the stillness was suffocating. Monica had not slept at all the night before. She had lain awake, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, listening to the steady breathing of her children from down the hall, her heart pounding louder than any sound in the house. Derek had barely slept either, shifting restlessly beside her, his arm flung protectively across her waist as if to anchor her to the moment. When the alarm finally buzzed softly on the nightstand, neither of them moved immediately. It was as though they were suspended in that fragile space between night and day, knowing that the hours ahead would alter the course of their lives forever. Eventually, Derek stirred, his hand brushing over Monica's arm, a silent reminder that they had to rise, that they had to face what lay ahead. They dressed quietly, their movements mechanical. Monica took extra care with Jaden's clothes, choosing a soft blue onesie and the little gray hoodie he always reached for when they went outside. He looked so small, lying there in his crib, his face relaxed in sleep, unaware of the day's significance. Monica bent over him, pressing her lips gently to his forehead, breathing in the soft, warm scent of her baby, and felt her chest tighten painfully. Malik and Corey stirred as they moved about the room, their tiny voices breaking the stillness. Derek's mother had arrived early to stay with them, her expression lined with worry as she hugged Monica tightly at the door. No words passed between them. None were necessary. Everything that could be said hung heavy in the space between their bodies. The drive to the hospital was quiet, the streets nearly empty in the early morning light. Derek's hand remained on Monica's thigh the entire time, his thumb brushing back and forth in a rhythmic motion. Jaden slept in his car seat, his face turned toward the window, oblivious to the weight of his parents' silence. The hospital was already awake when they arrived, bustling with nurses and doctors moving purposefully through the halls. Monica felt as though she were moving through water, her limbs heavy and slow as they checked in, signed forms, listened to instructions she barely registered. The pediatric cardiac wing was bright and clean, filled with cheerful posters and smiling faces, but none of it could soften the edges of her anxiety. The hours that followed unfolded like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Jaden was prepped for surgery, dressed in a tiny hospital gown that dwarfed his small frame. Nurses moved efficiently around them, attaching monitors, explaining procedures, speaking in gentle, soothing tones. Monica nodded when they spoke, but her mind couldn't process their words. All she could see was her son's face, his eyes wide and trusting, his small hand curling instinctively around her finger. When the time came to hand him over, she hesitated. She wanted to hold him tighter, to pull him back against her chest and never let go. Derek stood beside her, his hand firm on her shoulder, grounding her. Together, they watched as the nurse carried Jaden down the hall, his soft curls bouncing with each step until he disappeared around the corner. The waiting room was cold. The chairs were stiff and uncomfortable, the overhead lights too bright. They sat side by side, their hands clasped tightly together, speaking in hushed tones only when necessary. Time crawled. Each minute felt like an hour, each hour like a lifetime. Nurses came and went, offering updates, their voices calm and practiced. The surgery was progressing well. Jaden was stable. The doctors were taking their time, being careful. Each reassurance chipped away at the wall of fear round Monica's heart, but never enough to ease it completely. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the surgeon appeared in the doorway, his expression neutral but not grim. Monica's breath caught as he approached, Derek's grip tightening around her hand. The surgery had gone well. The repair was successful. Jaden was stable. The words washed over her like a wave, leaving her breathless. Relief and exhaustion crashed into her all at once, her body sagging against Derek's as tears slipped silently down her cheeks. They were allowed to see him in the recovery room once he was stable. Nothing could have prepared her for the sight of her baby surrounded by machines, tubes, and wires. His tiny chest rose and fell beneath the sterile white sheets, a faint beeping keeping time with each breath. He looked so small, so fragile, his skin pale beneath the harsh hospital lights. Monica sat beside his bed, her hand wrapped gently around his, whispering words he couldn't hear. Derek stood behind her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, his eyes fixed on their son. The days that followed were a blur of beeping monitors, nurse check-ins, and sleepless nights spent in a chair beside Jaden's bed. The hospital became their world, a bubble suspended outside of time. Monica watched her son's chest rise and fall, willing him to grow stronger with every breath. She memorized the sound of his heart monitor, the steady rhythm that reassured her he was still fighting. Malik and Corey were never far from her thoughts. Derek's mother sent updates daily, pictures of the boys smiling, playing, unaware of how their world had shifted. Monica missed them fiercely, her arms aching for their weight, but she knew she couldn't leave Jaden's side. Derek moved between home and hospital, balancing work, the boys, and the endless logistics of their new reality. He brought clean clothes, food Monica barely touched, and whispered reassurances late at night when the exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. They leaned on each other, holding tightly to the only thing that felt solid amid the uncertainty. The doctors spoke of progress in measured tones. Jaden was healing well. His oxygen levels were improving. He was eating more, gaining strength. Each small victory felt monumental, a light flickering in the darkness. But there were hard days, too. Days when Jaden spiked a fever, when the machines beeped urgently, when the nurses moved too quickly. Nights when Monica sat alone, staring at the ceiling, her mind spiraling with fear. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the surgery, the doctor met them in the hallway outside Jaden's room. She smiled, an actual, genuine smile, and told them that if all continued to go well, Jaden could go home in a few days. Monica felt her knees weaken, Derek's arm wrapping around her waist to keep her steady. Home. The word felt foreign, almost impossible. She had spent so long inside the sterile walls of the hospital, living in the rhythm of monitors and charts, that the thought of returning to their small, noisy house felt like a dream. When the day finally came, Monica dressed Jaden carefully, her hands trembling as she fastened the buttons on his tiny jacket. He was thinner than before, paler, but his eyes were brighter, his smile shy but real. Derek carried him carefully through the hospital halls, the weight of his son solid and warm against his chest. At home, Malik and Corey greeted them with squeals of excitement, their small arms reaching eagerly for their brother. Derek's mother stood in the doorway, tears in her eyes as she watched them reunite. The house felt alive again, filled with the noise and chaos that had been missing for so long. But it wasn't the same. Everything had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. That night, after the boys were asleep, Monica sat in the nursery, her hand resting gently on Jaden's back as he slept. Derek stood in the doorway, watching her quietly. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They had made it through the hardest part, but the journey was far from over. The days that followed Jaden's return home unfolded slowly, tenderly, like petals unfurling after a long winter. The house, which had once been a whirlwind of sound and motion, seemed quieter now, as if everyone within its walls was holding their breath, afraid to disturb the delicate balance they had fought so hard to restore. Monica moved carefully through the spaces of her home, her footsteps light, her voice soft, as though the walls themselves were fragile and might shatter at any sudden noise. It wasn't fear that guided her movements anymore. It was reverence, an awareness of how easily everything they loved could have slipped through their fingers. Jaden slept more in those first days home, his small body still healing from the ordeal he had endured. His chest, once untouched and perfect, now bore a thin, pale scar, a line etched across his skin like a reminder of everything they had survived. Monica traced that scar gently when she bathed him, her fingers light and trembling, her heart aching with equal parts sorrow and gratitude. He was here. He was breathing. That was all that mattered. Malik and Corey seemed to sense the shift in the household, their usual wild energy tempered by an unspoken understanding that something had changed. They circled their brother cautiously at first, their chubby hands reaching out to touch him, to offer him toys, to sit quietly beside him when he napped on the living room rug. It was a strange thing to witness, these boys who had barely begun to speak, who could not possibly comprehend the weight of what had happened, yet who instinctively moved with care around their brother. Monica and Derek adjusted to the new rhythm of their lives with a quiet determination. There were medications to administer, follow-up appointments to attend, instructions to follow. Their days were scheduled down to the minute, a careful choreography of meals, naps, medications, and playtime. It was exhausting, but it was life, and life, they had learned, was a gift never to be taken for granted. In those early weeks, they leaned heavily on the support of their family and friends. Derek's mother came by almost daily, her steady presence a balm in the chaos. Monica's sister dropped off groceries and watched the boys so Monica could sleep for a few hours without worrying. Their neighbors brought meals, offered to run errands, sat with them on the porch in the evenings when the weight of the day felt too heavy to carry alone. Monica had never been good at asking for help. She had always prided herself on being strong, on handling whatever life threw her way without complaint. But this experience had taught her something she hadn't understood before, that strength didn't mean carrying everything alone. It meant knowing when to reach out, when to lean on others, when to allow yourself to be held. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of everything threatened to crush her, when the exhaustion settled deep in her bones, when the fear she had carried for so long bubbled back to the surface without warning. There were nights when she lay awake beside Derek, her mind racing with worries she couldn't quiet, her body tense and aching from the constant vigilance she had learned to maintain. But there were good days, too. Days when Jaden laughed, a sound that had become rare in the months leading up to his surgery, and the sound felt like sunlight breaking through the clouds. Days when Malik and Corey tumbled around the living room shrieking with laughter, their joy infectious and uncontained. Days when Derek pulled her into his arms at the end of a long, exhausting day and reminded her, without words, that they were still standing. As the weeks turned into months, Monica began to see the change in Jaden. He grew stronger, steadier. His color returned, a healthy glow replacing the pallor that had haunted him for so long. His energy slowly increased, and he began to move with more confidence, crawling after his brothers, pulling himself to stand, taking tentative steps between the furniture. There were still moments when her heart clenched, when he stumbled or grew tired too quickly, when he fell asleep without warning in the middle of play. But those moments became fewer and farther between. Each milestone he reached felt like a victory, a reminder that they were moving forward, one step at a time. Monica and Derek learned to breathe again. The conversations shifted from medical jargon and appointment schedules to mundane things. The boys' new words, plans for Jaden's first birthday since the surgery, the prospect of taking the boys to the park now that the weather was warming. They laughed more, smiled more, allowed themselves to imagine a future that wasn't overshadowed by fear. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky and cast a warm glow across the living room, Monica watched as Malik and Corey raced across the rug, their laughter ringing through the house. Jaden sat nearby, a stack of blocks in front of him, his brow furrowed in concentration as he carefully stacked one on top of the other. When the tower toppled, he looked up and caught her watching, his face breaking into a grin so bright it stole her breath. Derek entered the room a moment later, dropping his keys onto the counter and crossing to where she stood. He slipped his arm around her waist, following her gaze to their son. "He's doing good," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. Monica nodded, leaning into him. "They all are." It wasn't until later that night, when the boys were asleep and the house had settled into its familiar quiet, that Monica realized how much had changed. She stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing bottles, the hum of the dishwasher filling the background, and felt the weight she had carried for so long begin to ease. She thought back to the months before, to the photo session that had started it all, the innocent afternoon filled with laughter and light, the moment that had cracked open their world and revealed the hidden truth beneath. She thought about Amara, about how a stranger's quiet observation had set them on a path they hadn't chosen but had survived. The next day, Monica found herself scrolling through the photos on her phone, pausing on one in particular. It was a candid shot Amara had taken, a moment when Derek had scooped all three boys into his arms, their faces flushed with laughter, their tiny bodies tangled together in a tangle of limbs and joy. Monica studied the image for a long time, her fingers tracing the edges of the screen. They had been happy then, despite everything they hadn't known. And they were happy now, despite everything they had endured. Later that evening, she sat with Derek on the porch, the soft hum of the neighborhood around them, the boys breathing audible through the baby monitor on the table. The air was warm, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange. "We've been through a lot," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Derek reached over, taking her hand in his. "Yeah," he replied, "but we made it." Monica smiled, squeezing his hand. "And we'll keep making it." For the first time in a long while, she believed it. Not because the road ahead would be easy, but because they had learned that strength didn't come from avoiding hardship. It came from facing it together, from holding on when everything seemed to fall apart, from finding light in the darkest places. As the sky darkened and the stars began to appear one by one, Monica sat there, her heart full, knowing that whatever came next they would face it side by side, together, as a family. The summer sun returned to their neighborhood gently, warming the pavement and filling the air with the sweet scent of fresh grass and blooming flowers. The days had grown longer, and with them, the cadence of life in the Brooks household had begun to settle into something soft and steady again. It had been months since Jaden's surgery, and though the memory of that chapter still lingered like a shadow in the corners of their minds, it no longer consumed the light. Monica woke one morning to the sound of laughter echoing down the hallway, the unmistakable giggles of three small boys who had, by some miracle, learned to find each other in the early dawn hours without waking their parents. She rolled onto her side, stretching lazily, the heaviness in her chest that had lingered for so long now replaced by a quiet, humming peace. Derek was already awake, standing at the window, the glow of the sun casting soft light across his face. He looked over at her when he heard the laughter, his smile slow and easy. "They're up early," he murmured, his voice still rough with sleep. Monica sat up, brushing her curls back from her face, and for a moment they simply listened. The soft shuffle of small feet against the wooden floor, the high-pitched squeals of delight, the babble of words only half-formed but unmistakably joyful. It was the music of their home, the sound that had once been drowned out by machines and monitors and the cold, sterile hush of hospital rooms. Now it was back, louder and brighter than ever. Later that morning, as the boys tumbled around the living room chasing each other between scattered toys and pillows, Monica's gaze lingered on Jaden. He moved easily now, his steps quick and confident, his laughter ringing out as he darted behind Malik and Corey. There were still moments when she caught herself holding her breath, waiting for the stumble, the pause, the shadow of fatigue she had watched for so long. But those moments were fewer now, and when they came, they passed quickly, leaving only the radiant reality of her son growing stronger every day. Derek appeared in the doorway, a small envelope in his hand. He crossed the room, his eyes warm as he handed it to her. Inside was a simple card, an invitation, carefully designed, with soft pastel colors and elegant script. It was from Amara, the photographer, who had reached out a few weeks ago to ask if they might like to do another session now that things had settled, now that Jaden was home and healthy. Monica had agreed immediately. The date was set for a Saturday afternoon, just as the heat of the day began to mellow and the shadows grew long across the lawn. In the days leading up to it, Monica found herself caught between anticipation and nervousness. The last time Amara had been in their home, her quiet observation had cracked open something fragile and terrifying. But now the idea of capturing this new chapter, their family whole and healing, felt like a full-circle moment. She spent the morning of the shoot bustling around the house, tidying toys and smoothing blankets, choosing outfits for the boys that would survive their inevitable antics. Malik and Corey resisted her efforts to keep them clean, laughing as they tumbled across the floor in their neatly pressed shirts. Jaden, ever the quieter one, sat patiently as she combed his hair, his small hand resting trustingly in hers. When the doorbell rang, it felt different this time. No longer the harbinger of something that would shatter their world, but a gentle knock reminding them of how far they had come. Amara stood on the porch, her camera slung over her shoulder, the same warm smile on her face. She greeted them with ease, her eyes soft as she knelt to greet the boys, who had grown so much since she had last seen them. Monica caught the subtle flicker of recognition in her expression when she looked at Jaden, the understanding that passed silently between them. The session unfolded in the backyard, the late afternoon light casting everything in a golden glow. Amara moved effortlessly around them, her camera clicking softly as she captured moments that felt impossibly ordinary and precious at the same time. The boys chased each other through the grass, their laughter bubbling over as Derek scooped them up one by one, spinning them in wide, joyful circles. Monica sat on the porch steps, her arms wrapped around Jaden as he leaned back against her, his smile wide and unguarded. At one point, Amara lowered her camera and simply watched them, her eyes shimmering with something unspoken. When Monica caught her gaze, Amara offered a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had taken since that first afternoon. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawn, Amara called the family together for one final photo. Monica and Derek sat on the porch steps, their arms around each other, with the three boys clustered at their feet. Malik and Corey squirmed and giggled, Jaden leaned contentedly against his mother, and for a moment, everything felt still. The click of the shutter was quiet but final, the sound of a chapter closing. After Amara left, the boys tumbled back into the house, their energy undiminished despite the long afternoon. Monica stood at the door, watching them chase each other down the hallway, their voices ringing out like music. Later that evening, after the boys were asleep and the house had settled into its familiar hush, Monica and Derek sat together on the porch, the air warm around them, the distant hum of the neighborhood fading into the background. They didn't speak at first, content to sit in the quiet, their shoulders pressed together, their hands entwined. "She sent the photos already," Derek said after a while, pulling his phone from his pocket. Monica took it from him, her fingers brushing over the screen as the images flickered to life. Each photo captured something raw and beautiful. The boys' laughter, the quiet joy in their eyes, the way Jaden leaned into her without hesitation. She scrolled slowly, her throat tightening, until she reached the last photo. Their family, framed in the soft glow of the setting sun, whole and smiling. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, her heart full. "We did it," she whispered finally, her voice thick. Derek nodded, his arm tightening around her. "Yeah, we did." The storm had passed, and though the sky was not without clouds, the light had returned. Stronger, steadier, more beautiful for everything they had endured. As the night deepened and the stars began to scatter across the sky, Monica leaned her head against Derek's shoulder, her heart finally at peace. Whatever storms lay ahead, she knew now they would weather them together, with love, with strength, and with the unshakable bond of family. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. Make sure to check out other stories as well and share this video with someone who might need to hear it.